I regrettably have to start with a sad story. I tend to often tell my sad stories with a bit of a smile on my face. I don't know why that is, but when Baron Haussmann was rebuilding Paris, partly, we now know, so that the cavalry had easier access to certain parts of Paris, he needed some foreign workers. He brought in Belgian Catholics and German Catholics. He knew that bringing in foreign workers was a delicate matter, so he made sure to bring them from the north and to bring them Catholic into Catholic France. The French Catholic workers said, those are bad Catholics. I mention France because France was one of the countries which historically took in a lot of refugees, exiles. You know, when they're very fancy, they're called exiles. And yet even there, in the southern salt works, Italian Catholic women and children were killed by French Catholic workers. So I mention all of this to indicate that when we today think, not we here necessarily, but in general, our politicians, etc., that it is cultural distance, religious distance that is generating the types of racisms that are only getting worse, I think we fool ourselves. It's much deeper. It's much more complex. Today it is very easy to fall into the notion Muslim cultures, different religions, to sort of explain and understand. I think it's much deeper. I want to make two arguments, and I make them with a bit of detail. One argument is the argument that I just made. I don't need to repeat that. There is little time. I have a huge clock ticking away here at enormous speed. The other one is that we also have to ask ourselves, who are we, the citizens, today? And basically my call is for transversalities. Right now, if I look at what are the emergent, the new architectures for membership, there are two. Besides, you know, the standard issues of nationhood, etc. One is a very tight geography that cuts across north-south divide, east-west divide. It includes elites from Luanda in Angola and elites from Shanghai and elites in New York. They barely need citizenship. They can buy it. They can go through other modes, WTO mode 4. They have all kinds of options. So citizenship, ironically, is also devalued in that geography of privilege. And then there is another geography that begins to incorporate more and more people who are in supposedly, you know, highly developed countries, etc., where they are losing rights. One of my projects is two little projects. One is called Who is Gaining Rights? We, the citizens, were mostly not. We have made some gains in terms of questions of gay marriage, etc., but we are basically losing rights. And the ones who are gaining rights are the multinational corporations. And if we sign the new treaties, the Trans-Pacific and the Transatlantic, they will gain even more rights, private justice for them. They don't even have to deal with national states. So this is a very peculiar moment. And it is a tragedy that in our countries, so many of our countries, I'm Dutch of origin, but you can see the same thing in the United States where I live, that there is this strong anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, who is the immigrant? We really have to ask ourselves, in the same way that we have to ask ourselves, who is the citizen? And so one way of thinking about it is this notion that there really are multiple immigration spaces within which this subject we call the immigrant is constituted. They're institutional, ideational, tactical. They produce the figure of the migrant. And here are some examples. I really think that you're a fast reader, so I'm not going to read it, but clearly it goes from privileged, where we don't call them immigrants, to sort of the traditional, hard-working, low-wage paid, etc. immigrant. The subject that comes out of that, again, the low-wage worker, the professional, etc., etc. So when we speak about the immigrant, we are actually talking about multiple. Am I blocking you from seeing what the slides are? I could try. There I feel like I would be in a church. And here I would probably disappear. It's taller than I am. So if you don't mind, I'll just stay here. Now, the question also of the instability of very basic concepts. I always say, you know, many of these very powerful concepts, the state, the middle classes, also clearly the immigrant, actually they're invitations not to think, not to ask ourselves, what am I talking about? And in my own research and scholarship, I'm always interrogating these terms, because it is really easy to navigate through all kinds of issues without asking, what am I really talking about when I use this word? So the remittances bit, what I want to point out, this is just the top few remittance recipients. So remittance is one example. The notion here is that many people assume that the remittances are sent by low-wage immigrants to poor countries. So then there is an added critique to the immigrant often, which is that, my God, they come here, they work here, they get our money, and then they send it back home. If you look at these top countries, India and China are totally bimodal, very rich and very poor. They're also sending. And then you look, there's also France, and there is Spain, and there is Belgium, and there's Germany, and the UK. They're also receiving remittances. From whom? From those immigrants we call professionals, foreign professionals all over the world. The United States, which is always complaining about all that money that they're losing through the remittances to Mexico and Philippines and I don't know what, the United States is among the top 20 in the world recipients of remittances. So there are many, many issues that we need to sort of revisit. Now, one very powerful notion to me is the making of informal social contracts. And very often they're good, they're not always good. One distinction that I like to make is there are certain citizens who are authorized but not recognized. So a whole variety of racisms. So in the United States, many blacks are simply, they are authorized, they are actually citizens, but they're not fully recognized. In this last election that we made, we know for a fact that over 100,000 who were there to vote were not allowed to vote, and they were mostly minorities. And then we have, interesting, an emergent sort of option, possibility, unauthorized but recognized. Now there are two variants. One is at top geography. They're actually not authorized to circulate among all of these countries with so much ease and to reside and to invest and to buy land and I don't know what all. But they can. But the other version of that is a long-term, undocumented immigrant who lives in a community, participates in all the rituals, take the child to school, the shots, and I don't know what. There are many. They're unauthorized, but recognized. And when I think of new modes of citizenship, I also think of the importance of that as some sort of ground. Now, what is happening today, I think, in Europe, in the United States, and probably in a bunch of other parts of the world, is the active making of a space of persecution. If I take the Latino population in the United States, there was a time when the United States was a space of opportunity. Never perfect, never very generous, but there was opportunity. Today, it's a space of persecution. Very important. The space of persecution is made. It is actively made through practices and through laws. And here again are a few ways, if you see the increase, and the years are there partly because that's before the crisis, this big economic crisis. So what you see is massive increases in a whole range of variables, that are constitutive of the story of control. Even more disturbing, immigration is now, as it is also partly in Europe, part of the national security apparatus. In the United States, we live So you do in Germany, so you do in the Netherlands, so you do in France, so you do in a whole, I don't know about Sweden. I always prefer not to speak about the country where I am speaking in, because chances are that the audience knows far more than I do. So, but I would be very, and I'm going to ask people maybe afterwards, somebody can tell me. So we have a set of laws that violate the Constitution, foundational document, but that are enabled because we are under a state of security. It's partial. We call it beautifully. Well, I say that with irony. I don't think the word patriot is so beautiful anymore, but the Patriot Act. And here is a whole set of issues that, point number 2, is a complete abuse of our Constitution. No state, subnational state, no locality can make immigration law. And look at all we are seeing here. Signing a contract, one government, a subnational state with a national state, total abuse of the Constitution. And the list is long and long. So we are actively expanding the operational space of our government, which is enabled by the state of security. And again, we know that it is happening also in Europe. Now, one very interesting issue which is happening, again, throughout Europe, really, again, I don't know about Sweden, maybe not, the high seas jurisdiction notion. I don't know if people are familiar with that. But if you are, the high seas jurisdiction comes from medieval times, it's an old one. But the idea is that it is a zone, literally in its origins, in the ocean, where merchant ships cannot always be subject to the law of their own state. Emergencies might arise, etc. So the law is suspended. In the Mediterranean, Little Sea, there also is a high seas jurisdiction. So some of you, I'm sure, know. There was a time when the attempt was to send the migrants back with, the undocumented coming over when they were in that high seas jurisdiction before they entered national waters, in this case of Italy, Greece, Spain, etc. Because there, they were not in, if they did that, they were not in violation of the non-refoulement law, that you are not allowed to send back, not to receive asylum seekers and refugees. But also in Charles de Gaulle, in J.F. Kennedy, in Schiphol, in a whole variety of airports. What have our governments done? In Heathrow also. They have implemented a high seas jurisdiction, which allows them to send back those they don't want. Back on the plane you go, without violating a law. So my question with all of this is, we might think, okay, this is the immigrants, this is the undocumented, etc. But at what point does it reach the citizens? In the United States, it already is. So, it is a bit of an extreme. So one way of thinking about a lot of this is to think that we need to begin to disassemble some of these categories. Again, very, very quickly. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But power and powerlessness, very important. And one question I ask myself is, where do the powerless get to make a history? And one answer is in cities. And so I think that our cities are a crucial space. Big cities, slightly anarchic, slightly, I always think of the city as a complex but incomplete system. So an office park, very dense, is not a city. That's not the space I'm talking about. That is simple and closed rather than incomplete. But the notion of informal social contracts can thrive, can be generated in a city in a way that it cannot, again, in an office park. So there are very particular spaces. The question of exclusion and inclusion. Many citizens in a country like the United States are excluded. In fact, in my new book, I argue that we have to use stronger language. They're expelled, they're out. And increasingly they include your average middle-class American. It's not just racialized peoples. So there is something happening. I think it's a history that in the West, in the United States starts 30 years ago in the 1980s, and in Europe it really takes off also in the 1990s. Things have changed, and back to this notion of transversalities. how do we actually exit these vertical silos with respect to our nation state, etc., and begin to also see the possibility of transversalities. So now on to the question of who's gaining rights. And one of my hobbies is to look at this question. And it starts in 1996. Well, I should back up that my dear husband, Richard Sennett, thinks I work too hard. And so he told me, you need a hobby. Now, I grew up in Latin America, and his hobby is cooking. I'm very happy with his hobby. But, so I grew up in Latin America where the word hobby doesn't really exist. I mean, it's a very English Anglo word. And so it was 1996. Clinton had just signed his President Clinton in the United States, his immigration law. In this immigration law, which I studied, there was actually a whole set of issues that concerned us citizens and that took away rights. So one of them was the right of a citizen of the United States to go to a lower order court and launch a lawsuit on behalf of the rights of immigrants or of an immigrant case. We lost that right. We were excluded from using the judiciary zone to launch lawsuits. So I went to my husband and I said, Richard, I have a hobby. I am counting all the rights we are losing. He, of course, said that's not a hobby. But actually, and now I have a little network, because I've just written with other people in all these highly developed countries, and we are losing rights. And again, as I said in passing, if we sign those trans-Pacific, etc., treaties, we're losing more rights. So they're very trans-Pacific and transatlantic. Now, this is another version of losing rights, and I'm dying to ask, to raise your hands. Who has seen this map? This map has been in the public domain. In other words, there are a few people, but there are very few. It has been in the public domain since 2010. I would never show it here if it were not in the public domain. But this is over 10,000 buildings, mostly private, who are in the full-time business of gathering data on all of us who are in the United States. Whether you are a visitor, you also fall into that group. Whoever is in the territory of the country. Now, I want to dwell 2 minutes on this. These 10,000 buildings are huge. And in fact, if I just very quickly, if you go to Washington, which is the headquarters of the whole thing, 33 new buildings have been built to engage in this full-time looking. And they occupy 17 million square feet. And here are interesting points. The equivalent of almost 3 Pentagons, and the Pentagon is huge, or 22 US Capitol buildings. The US Capitol is the house of democracy. So that's very interesting. Now, back to this. Can I back up here? Yeah. So here is how this works. This is a full-time 24-hour, it never stops, gathering of data. My university has the right to read my email. They don't, because they are a proper institution. But if the chips are down, as we say, they would, of course, read it. But you know the story. I don't need to tell you that part of the story. What is interesting is it has about 1 million people, and of course Mr. Snowden comes out of this setup, right? He was in Hawaii, etc. So and those buildings are not included here. But they are full-time gathering 1 million people with top clearance. Very international, adorably international. If your best algorithm builder is an Indonesian mathematician, hey, she's there. So you have a whole really nice international setup of just great minds and very talented people. Mr. Snowden is very talented. And I'm very grateful, by the way, to Mr. Snowden. I don't know how other people feel, but because when I started to show this map in the United States, they couldn't get it. It was a visual event. Nothing against visual events, by the way. Here with artists, careful. But my son is a visual artist, so we're fine. And then after Mr. Snowden came out, people began to understand what this was about, that this was real. This is not just red little dots. It's not a performance piece. Now, so the logic is that to keep us safe, we are all suspect. You know, you can ask yourself, who benefits from that logic? Well, the technology firms, the builders, clearly. I mean, there's a whole set of people who benefit from it. But is that the best way to go about it? That in order to keep us safe, first, we all are suspect. They don't say that that's the logic, but that is the logic. So again, back to my citizens, immigrants, we need transversalities. We need these geographies that cut across. So I wanted to end up by going back to the question of immigration. I was here on a tribunal, a Bertrand Russell-style tribunal. I don't know if you know what those were. I played the role of a judge. Those tribunals are, it's enacted, so the statements come from real immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers, but actors do the reading. If you had the real person, it would just be too powerful, too, you know. And I was a judge, and I'm not a judge, by the way. And another judge was a famous Swedish author who has written very critical books about Sweden. I cannot remember his name, which is terrible, but it will come. And it was an extraordinary experience for all of us. I have long done research on immigration, etc. The stories I heard, I had never heard before. And I wonder if it is time to do another one, but maybe like in New York and in, I don't know, Paris, Berlin, you know, in other places as well. We are facing, I think, a very difficult moment. It is not easy to handle the combination of trends. In the United States, for instance, we have millions and millions in prison who simply disappear. We have right now over 300,000, this is just general people, I'm not just talking about immigrants now. We have over 300,000 immigrants in prison, not for criminal acts, but because they were caught, active persecution almost, without having their proper documents. We know, because they have lawyers, that many of them are citizens. They were just not carrying their documents. Very simple device makes it possible to keep them in there for 2 or 3 years. Many are still there, more than 2 or 3 years. What is the simple thing? They are not granted a hearing with a judge. Now, in Europe, you have different versions of that, but you have that. Now, these are very low-level, low-energy, little interventions with incredibly tragic outcomes. I mean, lives ruined. The final point I want to make about the United States is that immigration used to be, you know, the Immigration and Naturalization Service as an institution that took care of it, etc. Now it is part of Homeland Security. Now, Homeland Security means national security, etc. You understand what I'm talking about. I intersected with a case in Germany, which was 3 sociologists, some of you must know that the Attorney General, under National Security Act, we forget that our countries are under national security, exemptions from the state respecting its own law. The Attorney General of Germany threw those 3 people in jail, and nobody knew where they were. Their families didn't know where they were. And so we heard from the wife of one of them, and we wrote this story, and so a bit of hoopla happened. But Germany, the United States, we know, is quite, but Germany, after World War II, has tried very often to be very proper and very correct. But under national state security, this is lawful. This is not illegal. And so my question also is here, us in Europe, how much do we know? I'm sure that people here know a lot, but the general sort of population, or the average citizen, I don't like that expression, but there it is. I mean, how much do they really know of that? There are these edges, these spaces in all our civilized societies where terrible things are happening, extraordinary abuses of law. And then I look at the politics. And one thing that strikes me, in the United States, very, very strong, but I sense it in Europe as well, which is we don't have political language that say the working class family who is experiencing more poverty, the modest middle class person experiencing more poverty, who then, the only language that we have is the language of racism and anti-immigrant, etc. And so we horizontalize, the immigrant, etc., is the guilty party here, instead of developing a political language that alters the foundational building blocks of that discourse. Now, I don't know how it is in Europe right now, but in the United States, it's really become extremely urgent that these going toward looking at the weaker, it's often blacks, but it's also immigrants, that the explanation for impoverishment of the middle class, for loss of jobs among the working class, etc., that is the other, the foreigner, etc. And then I want to come back to where I started, which is really, we fool ourselves if, I don't mean, again, we, but in general, the politicians, etc., we fool ourselves if we think that it is that difference. The differences are part of our humanity. There will always be there. Some differences are less attractive than others, for sure, but still, we need to go beyond that. And in that sense, I think that transversal, informal social contracts that can be beginnings of something that becomes more formal is a beginning, is a starting point. And also this notion that we, the citizens, are not as protected as we used to be. We, the citizens, are losing rights. We, the citizens, are sort of also at a loss with how do we begin to articulate a different kind of politics. So I want to leave you with this notion that it's not just the immigrants, the refugees, the asylum seekers. It is also very much just a general, larger population that has formal rights, is losing some of those formal rights, and is also informally being downgraded in the current sort of economics, political system that we have in our countries. I leave you with that very unhappy thought, but it really is a call to action. Thank you very much.